Hi everyone, welcome to the latest workshop in OFMA's Farmers Market Learning Series. Today we're here for Governance 101, Best Practices for a Great Farmers Market Board. Before we get started on the presentation, I'm just going to run through a few pointers and an agenda for this session. We'll be recording this workshop and posting it to OFMA's website for anyone to watch later. So please feel free to lighten your online Zoom time and turn off your video if you don't want to be on camera. And of course, help keep background noise to a minimum. Make sure you mute your microphone while the presentation is happening. We'll have a 5-minute break at 12:55, and our presenter will be stopping for designated Q&A time throughout the presentation. If you have a question before the Q&A and don't want to forget it, you can submit it through our chat box. Jess Land, the market manager at Oregon City Farmers Market, is our chat box manager, and she'll keep track of and collect our questions for our presenter to answer. Thank you so much, Jess. And if you have tech issues during this workshop, you can send those through the chat box to me, Amanda, as well. And chat is at the bottom of your screen. And when you chat, just make sure to click and choose the right person for your comment or question, whether you want that to go to the whole group or just to me or just to Jess. So let's just try it out. It would be great if you could type into the chat right now what role you play at your farmer's market, if you're staff or a board member or a vendor, and you may be more than one of those things. While you're doing that, I also just wanted to highlight the rest of our workshops scheduled this week and in April. We hope you can come to them too, see the full description of events and how to register at OFMA's website, OregonFarmersMarkets.org. And then one last thing before we begin, let's also thank our sponsors one more time. This learning series and offering these workshops to you for free would not be happening without all of them. So now I'm going to turn this over to Jess Hampton from the Nonprofit Association of Oregon. Jess is the Nonprofit Learning Programs Manager there and has worked in nonprofits for over 20 years. She's done trainings for OFMA's own board, and I'm super happy that now you can take advantage of her expertise for your board too. Let me just stop sharing the screen and then let's see, Jess.
Thanks, Amanda, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. And since this will be over the lunch hour, I will not fault you if you are eating. So, but I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you and bring up my PowerPoint. And we'll get started. Okay. So as Amanda mentioned, and confusion with Jess's, my name is Jess Hampton, and I am the Learning Programs Manager at Nonprofit Association of Oregon. And also, I've been working in the nonprofit sector for over 20 years. I grew up on the coast of Oregon in Tillamook, and I now live in Eugene. So I'm coming to you here, of course, from my home, like all of us. I wish I could be with you all in person, and hopefully that will happen one day soon. I want to bring a couple of notes up about tools and templates and resources that I'll be sharing. So a number of tools will come up throughout the presentation today on roles and responsibilities of board members. And so I'll be providing those back to Amanda. And I want to make sure you all know that since we're together today for an hour and 15 minutes, this is not going to be completely exhaustive, right? I could probably go into a lot of the topics that I'll be talking about at great length, and some of them have their own modules, but I spoke with Amanda and really narrowed down some things that we thought would be really useful to both boards that are members of OFMA as well as staff. So we're going to talk about those roles, and you'll get these follow-up tools and resources that I'll talk about. I also want to mention that the things that we'll be discussing really are the work largely of the board. So while AFMA is there uh, to help and providing all of these incredible trainings as well, a lot of the things we'll be talking about are things that should originate from the board, but I'm always here for you after our session if you have some questions that are technically about your own organization. I know some of you are 501c3s, some not, but I'm here to answer those questions and provide any additional tools and resources that you might be thinking about that I won't supply you with today. And another housekeeping thing I almost forgot. I wanted to let you know that you can go ahead and ask questions at any time. As Amanda mentioned, Jess Land will be monitoring the chat box, and she'll be interjecting at times. If you have a question, just bring it up as we go, but be sure to put it in that chat box. So with that, we'll get started. As you can see, we have quite a packed agenda for the day. But we're going to be able to go through quite a lot of things. First, I wanted to put some context around the differences between a staffed organization and an all-volunteer, or what we sometimes refer to as a working board organization. So we'll talk a little bit about that because I know some of you have staff, some of you do not, some of you have a market manager, some boards are doing all of the work of your market. We'll also talk about board roles and responsibilities and board rights and protections. And these really don't change too much. The Oregon Department of Justice Charitable Activities section puts out a little red book that many of you I know have seen, and it's called a Guide to Nonprofit Service and Board Service in Oregon. I'll be providing you with a PDF of that in follow-up as well. That you can print off, but it outlines really what your legal and fiduciary responsibilities are as a board member. And again, those don't really change from nonprofit to nonprofit. There are certainly nuances depending on your bylaws and your articles of incorporation, which we'll talk about, but largely they're the same. We'll also talk about officers and what those board officers, what those roles should ideally look like for your board, and how you can better flesh out your job descriptions to make sure that the work is shared among those officers, and how you're really, you have an effective governance model. Additionally, it's important to think about committees, and I know especially in working boards, you know, you're just trying to get the work of the organization done. You're all volunteer, you don't have staff yet. So it's difficult sometimes to think about, well, how do we have committees? And then that's additional time requirements. But I think it's important to talk about that because it lightens the lift among the board members. So we'll talk about how you can better organize committee structures. I also want to talk about board development. So that means board recruitment, retention, and orientation. And we'll have some tips and tricks and resources I'm going to provide you with that can better strengthen your board and develop it further so you have a really strong farmers market. And then lastly, just some tips for effective meetings that I think are a lot of times overlooked at organizations, but can be really powerful in strengthening and retaining board members because you're valuing time and having effective meetings and coming out with action-oriented steps. I know Amanda asked this question, but before we launch into talking about staffed organizations versus all volunteer organizations, I wanted to ask the question too and get an idea. I know many of you are board members, many of you are staff, but how many of you have a dedicated market manager? And if you just want to list in the chat box, whether your board or market manager or even a different staff member. You can just put that in the chat box right now. Excellent. I'm seeing things come through. Paid market manager, part-time contractor as a market manager, no ED, market manager at Milwaukee Farmers Market. Great. So many of you do have a paid market manager. Now, how many of you have an executive director? And I think it's important to delineate market manager from executive director. So sometimes your market managers will specifically deal with the daily operations just at days of market. Whereas if you have an executive director or a market manager who in their job description has lined out duties relative to also working with the board and doing those organizational duties. How many of you have a dedicated ED? I see some of you coming through no ED, I see executive director of the organization that oversees the market, but the market is only a piece of the organization. Some folks are doing both, right? Excellent. And some of you are all volunteer. Okay. Well, let's dig into that a little bit and look at the differences between a staffed nonprofit and versus an all volunteer nonprofit. So at a staffed nonprofit, it looks like this. And this is kind of in a perfect world what the Department of Justice charitable activities section lines out for you. And when I say the DOJ charitable activities section, that's actually the agency at our state that oversees all nonprofits, whether you're a 501c3, a 501c6. They kind of set out these fiduciary and legal responsibilities that all boards and organizations in Oregon should follow. So this is what a staffed nonprofit would look like, where we have a board who is really overseeing the long-term vision of the organization. So they are doing the strategic planning, or at least originating the strategic planning process and engaging staff and the executive director to go along with that planning. But the board is kind of at a 30,000 foot level overseeing the vision. They are also managing an executive director. So you imagine that you've hired a competent person, the board oversees that executive director, directs them to carry out that long-term vision, and then the day-to-day operations are guided by the executive director. So the executive director is then overseeing that staff. And I think this is important to point out because you're all of your boards and farmers markets are different in the way that they're staffed or not staffed. And you need to check your job descriptions for your market managers if they do also play an executive director role. And you need to be very intentional and clear about what those roles are for whether it's an executive director or a market manager. Conversely, at all volunteer nonprofits, it kind of looks more like this. So again, sometimes we call these working boards because the boards tend to do a lot of the work of the organization. So you have many, many volunteers that you're guiding. And if this looks more like your farmers market, it's going to be important to really think about the policies and processes that you have in place, which I'll be providing you with a number of templates to help you out with that. But it's really important to think about that so you have the most efficient and effective organization that the board is overseeing, because they're really overseeing with the absence of an executive director, you're overseeing the day-to-day work of the organization. And sometimes, like I said, market managers are operationally handling things on the day of market, but the board is also tasked with more operations than they would without a dedicated staff. Any questions about this? Okay. So you really have three key roles as a board member. And again, these don't really change among nonprofits in our state, and these are really lined out nationally as well. The first, and I would say most important role that you have is stewardship. So stewardship of the organization and its mission. Many board members and even staff, I would say, join a nonprofit because they have a strong mission alignment or a strong intention to, for a farmer's market, you want to provide community and supply fresh food to people. So as a board member, you've likely come on board because you have a strong mission alignment. And that's very, very important because, legally you are the steward of that nonprofit and you're expected to guide the organization both privately in the boardroom as well as publicly in your communities. So that feeds right into keeping your resources and efforts focused on your mission. So if you are a 501c3, and maybe even if not, I would say even if you're not, you should have a guiding mission statement just to direct, and if you're a 501c3, you definitely do, of course, but that mission statement is the core principle of your organization and something you should always be referring back to. And a tip that I tell to every organization I work with, and when I serve on a board or when I've been the president of a board, this is what I'll do is, in the before times, we would be meeting in person, right? So if we had a flip chart or a whiteboard, posting the mission statement in its entirety somewhere where everyone can see it. And now, since we're all virtual, at least for a while, posting that maybe at the top of the meeting and going over what your mission statement is, reading that aloud, or even sending it out ahead of time. If you're sending out a board packet for folks to review, make sure that mission statement is posted where people can see. And what that does is a couple of things. Number one, it helps people to know, to remember your mission, which allows them or encourages them to share that with folks. Say when you're out in the community and people say, oh, what is it that you do at the on the farmers market board? What is it? And so you can use that mission statement because it's fresh in your mind. You've seen it at each meeting. And you can use that to frame a kind of elevator pitch, which is about, if you haven't heard of an elevator pitch, it's like, 30 seconds if you were in an elevator with someone going to the next floor, how you could succinctly describe your mission. And I have worked a lot in rural Oregon, and in rural Oregon, so we call it a grocery line pitch because there aren't a lot of elevators. But so number one, posting your mission statement does that. And number two, should you find yourself making a difficult decision at a board meeting, it's important to be able to direct your board members back to that mission statement and say, okay, well, how is this decision we're making going to affect our mission statement, our mission, which is our core principle? And a lot of times what that can do is take out value conflicts that you might have around a decision. People get really attached to what it is exactly they want. But as a board member, you become the collective governing body within that boardroom. And it's imperative that you keep your resources and efforts focused on the mission of the organization. And then finally, a key role you would have, or you do have, is management and compensation of the executive director. And also for some of you, depending on whether or not you have a market manager, that's going to be the market manager. And so it's incumbent upon the board to determine compensation and also do things like regularly, whether that's annual or whatever it is you decide to do, regularly evaluate that key staff, whoever it is, because they need to know how it is that they're doing and what they can maybe better or how great they've done, and be able to get that regular feedback. So it's important to remember that, and we'll dig deeper into those things as we move forward. Okay, now this is outlined also in that red book that I mentioned from the DOJ a guide to nonprofit board service in Oregon that I'll send the PDF of, but it outlines these 3 duties because individually, as an individual board member, you all have duties. As we move forward, I'll talk about your collective duties in the boardroom. But here we have these 3 key duties. Your first is duty of care or duty of due diligence in performing your responsibilities. So what that really centers around is active participation and reasonable inquiry. So while you have a strong mission alignment, or at least you should, to your organization, to your farmers market board, it's very, very important that you, number one, actively participate. So that means being prepared and showing up on time at board meetings, which means, if you have a board packet, meaning financials, agenda, any of those things that go out ahead of time, ahead of your board meetings, you're reviewing those ahead of time. So you're ready to join that meeting, ask questions, make decisions, and all of those things. Additionally, reasonable inquiry means that you as a board member are asking important questions. So I've seen this happen a lot around financials because a lot of folks, and me included, you join boards and we're not all accountants or bookkeepers. And so you see the financials come across and everybody kind of says, yeah, they look great, without really kind of digging deeper. And as an example, I'll use an organization that was also a statewide kind of member organization I worked with a number of years ago. And I did a tailored training for them all around reading their financial statements. And I had, geared this towards having read 3 months prior of their financial statements. And so I built the presentation all around those 3 months of financials. Well, as I'm presenting, I say, well, I see here that you lost $10,000 in revenue over here, but I also see how you made up for it in this other area or eliminated costs here. So you can see how they kind of match up. And the executive director of that organization was in the training, and they had a pretty large budget, I will say. So he said, whoa, stop. Actually, I think that's a mistake. And so what it turned out to be is that it wasn't much more than a keystroke error. They went back and fixed it, but in the break, and he explained it, and it was very transparent after it became clear what had happened. A couple of board members came up to me during the break and said, oh, we saw that a couple months ago and didn't think it looked fine. We figured it was just nothing. And each of these board members who are coming up to me, none of them had raised this in that board meeting. So they really weren't having reasonable inquiry. And so I said to them, this is a perfect opportunity to remember that duty of care and thinking about reasonably inquiring. It is your legal and fiduciary responsibility as a board member to bring up those questions. And more often than not, you're going to see that they are easily answered, but it's up to you to bring them up. And I always also say it's kind of that old thing that we learned about in school, where if one person has a question, it's likely that more people do. And so don't be afraid to bring up questions, certainly around financial statements. Any questions on that? I see someone's asking if I'll be sending out the presentation slides. Yes. Yes, I will, Hannah. Thanks for that question. I'm just gonna, you're welcome. Okay, so moving on to a duty of loyalty to your organization and its mission. This centers around really having strong policies as a board. And I'll be sending you out templates of the 3 policies I'm going to talk to you about today. While these are not legally required, they are certainly encouraged for you to have by the Department of Justice, because the three of these policies just serve as a safeguard for you organizationally. And so what they are is, number one, conflict of interest, number two, whistleblower protection, and number three, document retention and destruction. So in your duty of loyalty, that means, number one, you're not financially benefiting from your service as a board member. And this really centers around the conflict of interest policy. And these templates that I'll be sending to you, or sending to Amanda, that you'll be able to access, are they're developed with an attorney. You can just plug in your organizational name, and you have to adopt these policies as a board, which I'll talk more about policies and how that should interact with the board in a second. But that conflict of interest policy outlines what you would do should a board member potentially have, or potentially financially gain from their service as a board member. And that also extends to family. Family members legally should never financially benefit from your service as a board member as well. So as an example of that, I worked with a board a number of years ago out on the coast, and they had a large event every year. And one of the board members, her brother, was a local caterer, and he offered to provide catering services for the event at a low cost to give them a break, and he would get business. But what this immediately did was present a financial conflict. Even though that board member wouldn't directly be gaining, her family would. So that's still a conflict of interest. The good thing was they adopted a conflict of interest policy, and that policy, when you access it, when you see it, that I'll send to you, it guides you through the exact process of what you should do should one of these conflicts come up. And what that is essentially, and what this organization did, is that board member excused herself from all discussion around who is going to be the caterer of their big fundraising event. She also, of course, abstained from voting in that decision. And then additionally, they went above and beyond, because it's a small community and they wanted transparency with folks. They got competing catering quotes. And so the brother came out with the best quote. And because they had adopted this conflict of interest policy, they were well within their legal rights to choose him as their caterer. So again, and that conflict of interest policy is really the most important policy you should adopt as a board if you haven't already. So any questions coming through on that?
So Jess, Hannah did mention, because of the conflict of interest policy being complicated when a board member is a vendor, they're inherently benefiting from the market. So what is that distinction? And do they represent like the community in general, or just vendors?
Right. So also, that's a great question. And in the conflict of interest policy, there's also an annual disclosures form. So it would be good for the vendors just to write on that disclosure form that, or the vendors who are also board members, to say that they're vendors. That serves as protection. And also it's important to remember the hats you wear. So when you're in the boardroom, you're not advocating for you just as a vendor, right? You're advocating for the mission of the organization. So again, stewarding and focusing your efforts on the mission and remembering that distinction. But if you line out on that annual disclosure form, you're just fine. At an organization I previously worked for, we had some similar things happen where we would pay board members to do trainings for us throughout the year. A couple of them also were presenters, but they just disclosed on that form that they potentially could be doing that, and it was fine. So there's some gray areas there, but as long as you're capturing that, it's just fine. And I will tell you, the DOJ, so the DOJ is the charitable activities section, is that agency that oversees nonprofits. A huge amount of what they do is around financial controls, sometimes embezzlement. And it's unlikely, and that's not meant to scare you. They are really there to help nonprofits thrive and survive in our state. And so they're a great tool and resource. It's unlikely they're going to come after you. And it's certainly, it's important that you record these things again as a safeguard for your organization. So did we have another question coming through? Oh, thanks, Jess. So Jess just posted in the chat the link to that red book I've been talking about. So check that out all again in the packet, the follow-up packet that I'll send. I'll send a PDF of that as well. So you can check that out, and it has all of these things in terms of individual and collective duties that I'll be talking about. So the second policy template that you'll receive is whistleblower protection. And what that is, and I will say I don't have an example for that one. Luckily, I've never had to use this, whether it's in volunteering for a board I've served on or any organization that I've worked with over the last 20 years. I haven't had to use whistleblower protection, but it's very important just to have it. We certainly see at the national level, this happens a lot at larger organizations where we'll have whistleblowers. And what that is if someone raises an ethical concern about your organization, and this policy guides you through the process of how the board would deal with that, because that is a board level issue. So again, just another policy to adopt as a safeguard and guides you through the process. And then third, document retention and destruction policy. So that doesn't sound that exciting, and people think, well, why would we need that? So I'll ask you quickly, how long should your organization keep the minutes of your meetings? And you can just put in the chat what you think it might be. How long should your organization keep meeting minutes? And check the chat. 7 years. Got some forevers coming through. As long as we exist. 3 years. No idea. Well, I'll tell you, and the reason it's so important to have this document retention and destruction policy is because a lot of us just don't know, and a lot of times we make the assumption that it's 7 years. I hear that a lot, and I think that's because it's this IRS standard that we hear for a lot of documents, but your meeting minutes, many of you are correct in that they should be kept for the duration of your organization until you have to, until you close, your meeting minutes should be kept. And that's because legally, they're the historic documents, the historic record of your org. And so they should be kept. So what this document retention and destruction policy lines out is it actually lists everything that you might have, whether that's financials, minutes, 990s and CT12s, which I'll talk about in a second. All of these things tells you exactly how long you should be keeping them. And I'll tell you, it's surprising at how much stuff you really don't need to keep for very long. So it's important to have that. And again, that's a board level policy to adopt. So thirdly, I want to talk about your duty of obedience to the law. And this means that you need to be filing, if you are a 501c3 organization, you should be filing. Oh, I want to answer this. Mary's asking, do we need to keep them as paper copies or are digital okay? Certainly digital are okay. And I would always suggest more people are moving to digital. If you are doing that, they need to be kept in a safe place, not just if you've got like a local server, you should also consider saving them on a cloud, or saving them in a couple of different places. I know at NAO, we have a physical server at our office. And we've now, through the pandemic, moved to also cloud-based storage because, what if also because it's a pandemic and we've all been working remotely, but something to consider is, what if your office burned down and your server was there and everything is lost? So it's important to think about as technology is evolving, how you can best safeguard all of your important documents. And I know a lot of organizations still do paper copies. And certainly if you have a larger level audit where you have an accountant come in and do an audit, they might request you to print out papers, or you might pull those from the files, but digital is definitely okay as well. So a duty of obedience to the law, again, is around making sure that you are filing your annual reports with both the federal government and the state government. So on the federal side, that's your 990 if you're a 501c3 organization. And your 990 is a snapshot of your previous year's financials, and those are available to everyone online. And for smaller organizations, which many of you are, this is going to be really simple. And it may not, you may have an accountant or a bookkeeper who does it, or if you're very small, it may be your treasurer who originates that process. But you as a board are expected to make sure that this is being filed every year. Additionally, on the state side, you're going to need to file your CT12 each year. And that's essentially a postcard, asks a couple of questions, really wants to know, you're saying, you know, we're still a nonprofit, we're still out here, and we haven't moved or whatever. But you need to be filing both of those each year, because what happens if you don't is after 3 years, if you haven't filed, you'll lose your tax exemption on the federal side as a nonprofit organization, and you'll lose your corporate status on the state side. And I've seen organizations that the board just assumed they were happening and have been very close to losing their status because they weren't just making sure that happened. And again, it could be, if you're much smaller, the treasurer originates that, but the board is making sure that's happening on a yearly basis. Any final questions on your 3 duties before I move forward? Okay. So now we talked about your individual duties as a board member. We're going to move forward to talking about what your collective responsibilities are when you step into that boardroom. What it is that's expected of you legally, financially, and how to be the best steward of your farmers market organization. First, as a board, it's expected that you approve budget and any annual expenditures. Okay, so and for many, if any of you, so nonprofits tend to have a fiscal year ending either a calendar year, December 31st, or many have June 30 fiscal year ends. So if you have a June 30 fiscal year end, and even if you're not a 501c3, it's really important to create a budget. That can be as simple as an Excel spreadsheet. And what that is, as a board, is you're taking a look back at your previous year, your expenses in terms of if you had staff or office space, whatever it was, your expenses from the previous year. You're also looking at your revenue from the previous year. What grants did you get? What fee-based services did you provide that brought in revenue? And then you kind of plug those in, of course, for the coming year to think about, we got this grant last year, it's multi-year, we can plug it into our next year, or we likely think we're going to get this grant, or all the grants are going to go out for, whatever it is, the revenue you think that you'll get from vendors or whatever it is, you plug that in for your next year. And that should happen usually, and I mentioned June 30th fiscal year end, because if that's true for you, I would start doing your budget probably in April. And that should originate with, if you don't have any staff, the board should really begin to put that together. This is where you might enact something like a finance committee, which I'll get more into, but a committee might be in charge of organizing the upcoming budget and then presenting it to the board for full approval. If you do have staff, this usually does run in conjunction with an executive director, because the executive director, especially if you only have an executive director, likely will be writing some of the grants, or maybe all of them. So they'll have a good understanding of that and expenses and revenue that are coming in and going out. But so start working on that, 2 months, a month out from when your fiscal year ends. So the board has plenty of time to review it and then adopt it. And like I said, that's important. It's also important in terms of financial controls. So you can use this budget, again, even if you're small and it's just an Excel spreadsheet, you visit this budget every couple of board meetings and it serves as a roadmap. It can change. Budgets are going to change. It's our best guess at the year coming forward. But if we don't have an idea of what that roadmap is, we really can't respond to any huge issues that arise, like a pandemic, how we can pivot and shift if we have lost revenue, or hey, if extra revenue comes in. That budget serves as a roadmap for your organization and encourages financial controls and allows the board to have a real finger on the pulse of what is happening financially at the organization. Additionally, for smaller organizations, it's really important to think about your cash flow. And that's not going to get too much into accounting, but when we're talking about cash flow, that is like on a monthly basis, what is coming in and going out at that exact time. So you got to check on April 1st. It's going to be recorded then. You have a complete snapshot in an Excel spreadsheet of what your cash flow is coming in and going out. And that's really important for small organizations. And I know I've worked at a really small organization where we had to really check our cash flow because while, we're hoping a grant's coming in this month, that they don't get the check out to us in the right time, that could affect our payroll, right? So we had to know our cash flow. And as an additional resource, I'll be sending a cash flow sheet for you to use as a board if you don't have a staff or executive director that's monitoring that. This cash flow, and even if you do, an executive director can use it, but this cash flow sheet outlines months and you can just plug in. It's really easy and intuitive. You can plug in what's coming in and what's going out for each month of the year, so you can have a real good understanding of cash flow should you need it. But that can be a great tool. So I mentioned those 3 policies. As a board, it's up to you to set policies. So again, as a board, you would, when you see these templates I sent to you, say, oh, we don't have these, let's go ahead and adopt them. So the board would then vote on the policies and adopt them. I've talked about determining mission and monitoring for accomplishment a bit, in that you need to stay focused on your mission, but it's also up to the board to, every couple of years, look around and say, is our mission statement still accurate? Do we need to change anything? Has our community changed? Our community's needs? Have our programs or services changed and changed our mission statement? So it's up to the board to look at that and make any changes to the mission statement if that's necessary. And I usually say every 2 years as a board, take a board meeting and raise it with folks. It's not often that you're probably going to have to change it too much, but you do want to visit it every now and then to make sure that it's still accurate. It's up to the board to ensure legal compliance, and if you need legal advice, I'm not an attorney, I cannot give you legal advice, but the board may hire an attorney. An attorney will always work at the pleasure of the board, meaning being guided and directed by the board. So should you need that, it is your right and responsibility to pursue that. You can also, if you have an executive director or a market manager, you can authorize them to work with an attorney on behalf of your organization, but it's up to the board to ensure that legal compliance and hire an attorney. So establishing or changing basic employee personnel policies and benefits. So especially if you're a very small market board and you don't, even if you don't yet have staff, it's important for you to maybe develop some of these policies around volunteers even. But if you do have staff, it's very important that the board establishes some basic personnel policies. And if you have benefits, what are those? Be really clear about what your processes are for taking time off, paid time off and vacation for your market managers or executive directors. What does that look like? So folks, are they asking, letting the board know when they'd like to take PTO? What does that process look like for each of you? That's really important, especially in maintaining any staff that you do have too. It's important to have those things laid out so expectations are understood across the board. I talked about selecting and managing the executive director or market manager, if that is true for your organization. Fundraising, I bring this up because it's not always going to be applicable to farmers markets. In a, you may not be you're already having an event probably once a week, right? But where fundraising is concerned, if you do desire at any point to go out for any grants, most, if not all funders I've seen, at least in the last 5 years, want to see that you have what's called 100% board giving. And what that means is each board member is giving financially to the organization, because as the financial steward of the org, it's important that you also are giving back. You, at some points, you're asking a foundation for money, right? So they want to know that you also have kind of some skin in the game. And sometimes people ask, well, I volunteer time, doesn't that count? No, what they want to see is a financial commitment. And what I will say is they rarely ever, never ask, or I think I've seen one funder ask how much people, or the percentage of money that comes from board members. But what we always say, and what most foundations want, is that each board member is contributing at a level that is meaningful for them. And that should always be anonymous within your board too, because for some board members, and this is on an annual basis, some board members that might be $5, some it might be 500. It should be anonymous what board members are contributing. But many funders want to see that. I will say that in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, some of these things are changing, and especially through the pandemic, where different, it's becoming more clear, I think, to funders that doesn't allow equal access. I've been hearing different conversations around this, but I just bring this up because you may see this if you ever do decide to go out for a grant, or if you already have that box that says 100% board giving, that's what it means. And I know that I have been in a situation where I gave $25 a year. That's all I could afford. I was in school, and that was just fine. And then that box could be checked.
Hey, Jess, Samantha. Sure. I just want to throw in also that this subject came on, that OFMA itself has gone the more diversity, equity, inclusion route on that, and we don't have a board giving policy like that, but we do have a policy, we do have a written statement of like why we don't include that. And so when we go out for grants and there's a grant that is saying that that is a requirement, we still apply for the grant and we explain why we don't have that and our reasoning behind that. And so I just wanted to throw that out there, what OFMA's own position around that is.
Yeah, and I remembered that you all had done that, and that might be something that you as boards, if there is a grant that you're looking to go for, you might talk to Amanda about accessing that statement, because I think that's really powerful and also goes a long way in letting our foundations know that sometimes this isn't an equitable practice. But I bring it up because it's something to think about. But on the other side of that, it's also important that every board member is engaging in fundraising in some way. That does not mean that every board member is going out and asking people for money or whatever that is, but maybe you're sitting down and making handwritten cards to vendors or something like that, that say, thank you from a board member. You're engaging in that in some way, because again, you're the financial stewards of the organization. Also, board development is really important. I have a whole little section we'll be talking about around recruitment and orientation. So we'll get to that in a second, but it's important that you as a board develop and have processes in place to sustain yourselves and to sustain your board members and provide ongoing training. Like, what better thing do you have than OFMA to provide these incredible trainings for you to get more knowledge, more understanding of your organizational roles, and how to strengthen your farmers markets. So OFMA is a great resource, of course. Also, approving any amendments to your articles or bylaws. So your articles of incorporation, essentially your articles and your bylaws you provided to the state and the feds to get incorporation and nonprofit status. Your articles pretty much just say who you are, where you are. Those largely don't change too often, but your bylaws are the constitution of your organization. So that has a bunch of stuff like meeting minute or how you record your voting, what your quorum is, all of those things. Your bylaws as the constitution, if you need to make amendments to those or change it, that is up to the board to do. And some of the things you'll find in your bylaws, and if you haven't read your bylaws, please go do it. So many questions, especially through the pandemic, that I receive from organizations could be answered in their bylaws. Certainly questions around process. So OFMA does rock. So some things to think about when looking at your bylaws are notice. Typically, each board meets, whatever the third Thursday of the month at 5:30, and that's quite all right. I bring this up because some boards have said, well, we post our notice in the local newspaper because that's what's required legally. And no, that is not true. You are not legally required to post notice of your meeting, and no one is allowed publicly to come to your meeting unless you invite them. I think the confusion comes from certain public or government agencies that have to do that. Nonprofits are not that. It is required legally that you provide adequate notice to board members. Especially this comes into play if you're having a special meeting. Board members should get adequate notice of a special board meeting. Quorum, that's the minimum number of people you need to vote at any meeting to pass anything. So that can usually be found in your bylaws. How you make motions, a lot of time, and voting procedures, a lot of times this is like kind of some variation on Robert's rules, but you'll likely find that in your bylaws. And if you don't, your voting procedures aren't always found there. If you don't have a specified voting procedure, it's very important that you adopt one. Whatever that looks like, it should be adopted by the board and consistently carried out in the same way at each board meeting. And I think it goes without saying that if you don't have a clarified and consistent way of raising motions and voting, it gets really confusing and people get mad. So it's really important if you don't see those in your bylaws to adopt them. Also, sometimes your bylaws can outline how your minutes are taken, your term limits of board members, not only board members at large, but also board officers. So read your bylaws for those governance questions you might have. I've talked a bunch about roles and responsibilities, but guess what? You also have rights. And I'll briefly talk about these because some of them mirror some of your responsibilities too, but one of your huge rights is setting the organization's budget and establishing or changing any policies. Now, again, that's up to the board to do, and a very important right that you have to use that organizational budget as your roadmap, of course, in conjunction with staff, if you do have staff. Also requiring accurate, thorough financial reports. It kind of goes back to that thing I said, if you have a question, ask, and ask for more information if you need it. You're the financial steward of the organization. It's important that you get answers. And again, by and large, it's going to be usually a simple answer, right? It's also your right to inspect any records of the organization unless confidential. Really, the only confidential thing we might see is something that is HR related in a way that it's private to the person, not private to their work or employment record. You can even review employment records if you need to, but it's something that's usually private to the person. And then making reasonable inquiries of the executive director or the market manager, if that is in their job description, if they're reporting to the board, asking them questions and expect to be answered within a reasonable amount of time. I will say this doesn't mean to micromanage your ED or your market manager. And to make sure if you're inquiring with them, it should usually be one point person from the board that's doing that. So if at a board meeting you have questions, it's usually, well, the president can reach out to the ED or market manager if that's true for you. It should be one point person, usually the president. There are also, oh, sure.
I said I'd give people just a few minute break right here at noon. So why don't we do that for a couple minutes, and then that way people can go get water, go to the bathroom, or just turn their screen off for a couple minutes, and we'll just get started right again at 1 o'clock.
Thank you. I lost track of time there.
Yeah, no worries. And if people want to hang around here too, if you have questions you want to ask Jess, that's fine, but she'll get started on the presentation again at 1.
Yep, here to answer any questions you might have. See something coming through on the chat. Thanks, Hannah.
Jess, maybe I'll ask a question then. I was thinking, what do you tell small nonprofits for where they can get help with like financial accounting or tax filing if they don't have someone on their board that just has those skills, and they also don't have a lot of money in the budget to just go out and hire an accountant to do that kind of thing? Where should they look?
There are a lot, well, for many, if you don't have someone with the skills on your board, I think it's now if you're under 75,000, the paperwork, 75,000 annual budget, the paperwork is really pretty simple and doable by the board, even if there's not an extensive amount of experience. But if not, I would reach out to NAO. We have a resource line, a helpline, and our resources manager, Susan Parsons, can direct folks to people who might be able to help, whether they're small or large, because we have partners across the state that we know about who might do that. But I would say if you have a small budget, because the paperwork is simple, I would encourage orgs to take it on. I mean, that CT12 is for a smaller organization is really like a postcard, yeah, and 990 is pretty simple, but certainly reach out to NAO. And I can I'll put Susan's email in the chat box.
And so orgs that aren't a member of NAO yet, it's okay if they contact her? I mean, I'm sure you want to try to.
That's
There's
true.
a lot of resources at NAO, and we recommend that people become members, but if they're not one yet, they could still reach out, or.
Yeah, and I'll bring that up. I hadn't said anything about that. We're not going to usually turn anyone away. We want everyone to have as many resources as possible, but strongly encourage membership because there's so much access to more that you can get. So maybe when folks come back, I'll bring that up as well. That's okay. Yeah.
Well, it looks like it is 1 o'clock, so I welcome you to keep going, Jess.
Yeah, I'm so sorry that we didn't get a whole lot of time on that break. Kimmy's asking is the market manager a voting member of the board? I wasn't sure, so I haven't been. Generally, no. Certainly if the market manager is employed by the board, that would mean you're voting on your own employment, right? and that's a huge conflict. So generally, no. If the market manager is directed and employed by the board, no, you shouldn't be a voting member. A lot of times, and of course, an ED or market manager in this case will attend meetings. You'll do report outs probably of what's happening operationally on market days, what's going on, but you won't have a vote unless it's somehow outlined in your bylaws, and that's the first place I would look. Generally, no. All right. So I'm going to jump back into it. And I think we went over your rights. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the cloaking law. This was enacted in the early 90s to encourage folks to join boards. Our society was getting a little bit more litigious and people were getting scared of sitting on nonprofit boards for fear that they might get sued for something. So the cloaking law provides you what's called qualified immunity for any negligent acts. And I've seen this used where it's a sad story, but not too long ago, a board came to us after their ED had embezzled a lot of money and they were kind of trying to rebuild. They were negligent really in their duties. They should have done what I was talking about earlier, reasonably inquired more, but they weren't. They had no criminal or civil liability in this. They were negligent. They could have done more, but they weren't held financially responsible. The ED did serve some jail time, in fact. So the cloaking law provided protection for them because they were negligent. It will not provide you any immunity if you are committing willful or fraudulent acts. So if you are also embezzling, this is not going to provide you any protection. Or if you're if one of those board members was in cahoots with that ED, this would not have provided any protection. Something I want to mention that Amanda brought up over the break is that if you're a small organization and you're uncertain about those 990 CT12s, those annual filings I talked about, you maybe don't have the expertise on your board for as far as the treasurer or any of those, any idea of how to do those, you can contact NAO. We have a resources helpline and we can connect you with maybe people in your area who like bookkeepers and things. But I also want to encourage, if you are a 501c3 or C6, please do become a member of NAO. And this is my plug, but we really do just have so many opportunities for board development, staff development, real direct access to that helpline that's so helpful. So I encourage you to become a member, and you can always follow up with me after this to see what that would look like. And we have a graduated scale. So if you're a smaller organization, you pay less than a larger organization for membership. For not yet members, our webinars are $30. For members, they're $15. We have deals you can get on Zoom as a member, and members only webinars and trainings. There are just a lot of benefits to becoming a member. So that's my plug. Finally, D&O insurance. You may have heard of this, or you may even have it. It's directors and officers insurance. And so this is provided by any private insurance company. You can contact them, but this provides qualified immunity for any wrongful acts that a board commits. So usually these center around, by and large, they're around employment issues or wrongful termination. If someone feels they're wrongfully terminated, they sue the organization. D&O coverage kicks in and pays the attorney fees and any settlement costs that would come out of that. So that would be something you contact if you have liability insurance. Contact that insurance provider and ask them more about D&O. And it's not something you're required to have. Again, it's another one of those safeguards. Now in a shift, talking about officers of the board. So we have board members at large, and those are all of you who are on the board. Your officers are, of course, your president. Maybe you have a vice president, but your secretary and your treasurer. ORS 65, which is the set of laws that govern nonprofit organizations in our state, requires 3 board members for a public benefit corporation, meaning you have to have at least 3 board members. You also have to have at least 3 officer positions, not in addition to those 3 members. They can be the same. So you have president, secretary, and a treasurer as officers. However, the same person can't hold all 3 offices. So,
I have a question really quick about that.
sure.
Do you happen to know, is it common that secretary is a board member? I'm just asking because I filled in as secretary because it's currently vacant. And I found it really hard, especially in the time of Zoom, to actively participate and also keep accurate notes.
That is a great question. And I think that is really important for our time in this virtual world. But yes, generally the secretary is a part of the board, and in fact does have to be, as outlined by ORS 65. You do have to have a serving secretary. A lot of times that does mean taking minutes. However, that the secretary doesn't have to do that. I know at organizations I've worked for, maybe if you're, especially if you're smaller, that is something that you can revolve around board members. But if you're staffed, maybe you task someone on staff to help out with that. We would have our office manager at a previous organization I worked with. She would attend and take minutes so the secretary could be very present, because we only had board meetings once every quarter. So it was, a lot going on. So while you do have to have a secretary position, that doesn't always mean the secretary has to take notes. But a lot of times it does look like that, which I'll get to right now. So the president just these outline some key responsibilities of each of these officer positions. And again, these are going to vary from organization to organization. These aren't legally outlined, but this is typically what we see. And the way, if you want to have a better structured board, stronger governance, it should kind of look like this. So the president, of course, presides at meetings. A lot of times will sign any documents and contracts, especially if you don't have staff. That will be up to the president. If you do have staff, sometimes the ED will be the person to sign contracts and stuff like that. The president originates meeting agendas too. And I see this happen if you do have staff. It's sometimes the board has a culture that will have the expectation that the staff does the meeting agendas, but really your board meetings are again, you're that governing body of the organization. So the agenda items should originate with the board, and the board president starts that process. So that can be, hey, for our upcoming meeting, sending out an email to the rest of the board, what agenda items do we have? And then additionally to your staff, do you, ED or market manager, have any additional agenda items we need to bring up? But the president organizes that process. The president also should originate any ED performance review. And that can be also in conjunction with an executive committee. You bring the officers of the board together to organize what the ED performance review looks like. And then, and while they're organizing the process, a lot of times other board or staff are also interacting in that process in some way, but the president should originate that. Secretary scheduling meetings, and then a lot of time it's regular, third Thursday at 5:30, whatever it is, but folks have adequate notice, especially of any special meetings. The secretary is maintaining meeting minutes. So even if you're the secretary and you're not recording those minutes, you should be making sure after a meeting that they're getting out to folks, where they are, whether that's on paper or digitally. The meeting minutes are somewhere safe. The secretary, those corporate records that we talked about, like 990, CT12, or any corporate filing, if it's amendments to your bylaws or articles of incorporation, that might originate with your secretary to make any changes and send those off to the state. But again, that's rare. The treasurer might chair a finance committee if you have it. Usually that's what it looks like for a treasurer. Of course, financial reports, making sure those are getting out and coming in, making sure tax forms are being filed, and getting the annual budget going. And while these are typical responsibilities of each of these officers, again, this will deal upon a lot of interaction from other board members, but it's usually these folks who head up these particular bullets. So as far as committees go, I mentioned at the top of our time today, it's difficult sometimes to think when you're committing so much time to an organization of also committing maybe more time to committees. But again, to lighten the load of the larger board, organizing yourselves in committees can lead to a more directed effort and can really strengthen the board. I will go ahead. Is that Jess?
It was. I was just, since we were just discussing the meeting minutes, Melanie had a question for you. And I was wondering, is it okay to ask that right now?
Yeah, go ahead.
So she's wondering, for the meeting minutes, what are the legally required elements that minutes must contain? I know they don't actually have to include this person said that, even though we might write all of that down.
That is an excellent question, Melanie. So what has to be recorded is who was present, what the vote is about, how many yays or nays, what passed and what didn't. You don't have to record, well, Melanie was talking about this or that, but all of those, the way, what decisions were being made, who was present, and how many yays, nays, those things. And I would record who the people were that were yays, who were nays, whether it passed or didn't pass, have to be recorded. And remember, if anything should ever be brought up with your organization through the DOJ or whatever, your meeting minutes are the first things to go back to review, and that's the first thing they'll look at. So while you aren't required to capture all of the conversation happening, and likely you won't want to, try to pick up things that could be important in the future. You bet. Thank you. And I know we don't have much more time, but I want to hit on committees. So a finance committee is likely reviewing financials ahead of the larger board meeting, so they can and usually that's the treasurer. Maybe if you have an outside bookkeeper, they can sit on the committee, but they're reviewing financials ahead of the meeting to surface any questions that might come up to the larger board. It's just a way of lightening the load for the larger board meeting. And committees, it should be mentioned, you don't have to, it doesn't always have to be that every person in a committee is a board member. You can bring in outside non-voting people, but your committee, of course, should be helmed by someone who is a board member, and likely a couple. Some of these, like a finance committee, really shouldn't have anybody outside unless it is your bookkeeper or accountant, because those are sensitive documents. As well as it's unlikely that you'll have anyone from the outside come into your governance or executive committee, because governance is looking at board recruitment and retention. Executive committee is looking at, how do we head up staff evaluations or hiring or something like that. So those are more sensitive issues for the internal board to talk about. But something like fundraising, you might bring in someone who's not on your board, who's a real community connector, knows a lot of people, or who's great at grant writing. They can sit on your fundraising committee with you. And then ad hoc really means it's a committee that's comes up maybe once a year for, say, an event. You have an annual huge gala or whatever it is. You'd have an ad hoc committee that plans that and then engages the rest of the board to have the event. That's an ad hoc committee, but this can really lighten the load of the larger board. I want to mention board notebooks. If you don't have a board notebook, what this is, it's just what it sounds like. It's a 3-ring binder usually, or it can be digital as well. But it is something you give to new board members or even existing members if you don't have them right now. But they include a bunch of really important things, your minutes. And for a new board member, I say for minutes and financials, about 3 months previous, 3 to 6 months previous of minutes and financials for a new board member in this board notebook. So they can review what you've done in the past, get questions answered, so they're ready on day one to make decisions in your boardroom. Any important papers you have, like your bylaws, your articles of incorporation, any policies, the 3 that I'll be sending you, you want copies of those. If you have a strategic plan, you'd want to include it. Any action plans or your committee structure. And then also board job descriptions. This is so incredibly important if you don't have them. Because simply having job descriptions can really change the game and make a board much more efficient. And Amanda is asking for farmers markets, would the vendor handbook be included in the notebook? I really can't answer that. This is really more board oriented, but certainly if the vendor handbook helps inform the programs, services, all of that of the farmers market, then yes, include it. Because I would even include in that notebook if you have any marketing material. So new board members can see that. What do you look like? And yeah, so I would say, yeah, for the vendor handbook, how are you interacting with vendors? What does that look like for you? It gives them that context and idea of how they can better do their board service. Anything that can develop their board service will be helpful. But certainly board job descriptions. So we oftentimes as volunteers on a board, well, why would we need job descriptions for volunteers? It's incredibly important because I know for me personally, I don't want to join a board if I don't have a firm understanding of the expectations of me. Because even though we're volunteering, I'm passionate about the mission. I need to know what's expected of me, right? I need to know things like, what are the terms? What are my term limits going to be? Are there any fundraising or giving expectations? What's my time commitment each month just for the board meetings or outside work? Event attendance, am I required to come to the market every week, or is it once a month, or what does that look like? Anything else you might include in these job descriptions? Excitingly, I will be providing you with templates of both board member at large descriptions as well as board officer descriptions. So you can take these templates and make them your own, but we put boilerplate language in there of kind of the basics of anything you might expect from kind of the baseline for boards, but you can make those your own and then adopt them into how you work as a board of directors. Looks like Sean's asking about the balance on a farmer's market board between member directors and community directors. You mean members who are people who are vendors, and then folks from the community at large? Gotcha. So I really can't, there's no legal requirement for you on that. I would say it depends on the culture of your organization, really what works for you. I would certainly want to have a diversity of opinion within your board, but I would also say that probably your vendors have a good amount of understanding and knowledge as well. But for folks in the community, you want to have that outside perspective of your farmers market as well. So I can't give you an exact number. I think it's important to find a balance. I'm sorry, I can't give you an exact number on that. It really changes from board to board on that. So you've got your board notebook. You're all set to go. What I see so often happen is that boards then don't have a board orientation, and you should. So you give a new board member that board notebook. They feel like they're a part of the team. They have this thing. They've got all of your documents. They're excited. Sitting down with them goes a long way, not only in answering any questions they might have, but also retaining them for the future. They feel a part of your team. They also feel like they have a great amount of information to get going and make decisions immediately with you. So this is simple. Sitting down for maybe an hour, and in the virtual world, it's probably Zoom, right? But you're getting together with, if you have a staff member, them and a board representative, usually the president will sit down with a new board member. You go over the board notebook. If you have an office, you tour the facilities or the market, whatever that is, introduce them to any additional staff you might have. And like I said, they'll feel like they're part of your team. They're ready to go. They have all the information they need to be able to start making decisions with you. So that's very important, not to forget. A little of this goes a long way. So I know I'm a little bit over time, Amanda.
It's okay, keep going.
I'm sorry, and this is my last slide. So I just wanted to bring some of these up because I think that also if you just have some tips for effective meetings, this can really strengthen your board as well. So a couple things to think about. Group norms. So having a list at each board meeting of norms, a simple set of them would look something like respect of other people's opinions, be on time and ready, mute your cell phones if that's important to you, things like that. But a short list, no more than 5 of group norms that you, as a board too, it's important if you adopt these group norms. It's not something that you have to vote on to adopt formally, but you should informally come up with this list as a board. Again, no more than 5. That how you're going to run your meetings, what that looks like, those norms are for each of your meetings. And then you say, okay, does everyone agree on these? These are our group norms. Everyone says, yeah, we agree. And what that does, and you take them to each meeting and they should be posted visibly somewhere also. And you should go over them at the top of each meeting. I do this with every group I work with in a longer term project. And so if things kind of go off the rails, you can say, hey, I feel like we're kind of getting away from what we were originally talking about. Remember, we're supposed to respect everyone's opinions here in the group norms. Whoever's facilitating, kind of bring it to the group norms or your working rules together. So that can be very powerful. I mentioned posting your mission statement, also very powerful to keep your resources and efforts focused on your mission. A parking lot. It sounds silly, probably many of you are familiar with this, but if you're not, a parking lot is somewhere, a flip chart, or in the time of Zoom, you're in a Word document. If someone at a meeting is bringing up something that really is not within your agenda for that meeting, you can say, you know, this is important, but it's not really what we're talking about today. Can we put it in the parking lot? So you list it in your parking lot, you park it, right, on this list of parking lot items so that you can follow up with folks about that later, or you put it on the agenda for the next meeting, if that makes sense. What you should never do is have a parking lot with a list of things that you park and then you don't revisit them again, because people then feel like their opinion or thoughts weren't valued. But in an effort to keep your meeting focused and start and end on time, some things need to go into that parking lot. Also, starting and ending on time is incredibly important, especially now with a lot of Zoom exhaustion, all the things that we're going through. If you have a meeting start and end on time, and then after the meeting, making sure that you're simply sending out an email with all of the action items. Okay, this is what we talked about. This is who's doing what and when. And just that follow-up after your board meetings of those action items is super powerful. People have accountability. They know what's expected of them. And with that, and I did not end on time. I apologize for that. There's a lot of great information here, but I want to thank you and encourage you to reach out to us at NAO, reach out to me. Amanda can give you my email. I encourage you to become a member. If you're not a member, I still would love to hear from you. We really, at NAO, no matter what, want to see the nonprofit sector in our state thrive. And so whatever it is that we can do to help you, we're here. Who does the action follow-up, the secretary or the president? Really, it should be whoever is taking it should be the secretary, whether or not they're taking notes. Anything related really to minutes should come from the secretary. The president originates the agenda. Secretary really deals with the minutes. But thanks for that question. So feel free to follow up with me. I know you have some time to meet today, Amanda. Probably want to come back in and I'll stop sharing this.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. This was perfect timing. We could even take a question. If there's any last questions that anybody has, we have like a minute or two if anybody wants to ask anything. Eileen?
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, great. My mic sometimes doesn't work. So, our farmers market was looking into D&O insurance or errors in admissions or something like that. So if there's a blanket coverage for unintentional stuff, the D&O insurance, I mean, with a farmer's market, what would that be? I mean, if nobody intentionally, sent somebody loose with machetes or something weird like that, how necessary would it be for a small organization that doesn't have a lot of money to spend on something like that?
Yeah, I hear you on that. And like I said, it's something around like 90% of D&O claims are wrongful termination. That was the last time I checked. So that's been maybe a year. So if you don't have staff, that might not affect you as much. However, and you would have to check with your insurance agent about different levels of coverage and what that would mean for you if you bought that coverage, right? But I would say, as someone who serves on a lot of boards, it is a question that I ask. Do you have D&O insurance? Because while it's not something that thankfully is often used, I like to know that as a board member, that's an additional protection for me, certainly if that organization is staffed. If you're smaller, if that's not a concern, you should weigh kind of the pros and cons of buying it.
Yeah, and I'm not going to hold you to this, but for instance, we're sort of a hybrid of that model you showed. There's myself and the assistant market manager, and we're technically not paid. We get a small stipend. We wouldn't be legal if you figured out our hours that we work and what we get. We're sort of volunteers with some compensation. So that's where we stand. I wouldn't think either one of us would be particularly litigious if they got rid of us. And I'm not too worried about them getting rid of us. I don't know. But
yeah, and the thing is too, like I mentioned with the cloaking law, so that federally protects you if the board and staff, well, we're just talking about board here, it protects the board if there's any negligent action. So if it could be proven that the board's not intentionally wrongfully terminating you based on discrimination or something, it would be pretty difficult for you to bring suit anyway, and the cloaking law would provide protection against that, which is not, it's a law, right? So it's not insurance. So for smaller organization, that protection is in place.
Thanks for the insight.
The Farmers Market Legal Toolkit, which is online through the Vermont Law School, also has information about all kinds of risk management, including more info on D&O insurance.
That's great.
It's another resource there. So I think that's it now. We're at just about 1:30. I want to thank everyone so much for coming. As you're leaving, if you want to throw into the chat like one word on what you're taking away from this workshop and what you hope your board would work on first, whether that's like job descriptions or that notebook or your tax filing or something like that, that would be great to see as you head your way out. Thanks everybody for being here.
I'll also, I wanted to mention quickly, I'll send you a table of contents of what you should have in your your board notebook as well. So
That's great. Thanks, everybody. Have a good afternoon. And thanks, Jess Land, for handling the chat for us. You did a great
thank
job.
you. Thanks, everyone.